Notre Dame opens a week from Sunday night against Miami, and when they go out to take the field against the Hurricanes, they'll be led by CJ Carr. Quarterback decision made by Marcus Freeman and his staff this week. Not really a surprise to people who have been following it. That had been the expectation. However, people close to the program say that that was actually a real race. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in these quarterback races is that, you know, a tie goes to the runner, supposedly in baseball, if umpires do their job, which is rare. But tie goes to the runner. Tie always goes in quarterback race to the guy with either the higher projectable ceiling or the guy that people will be clamoring for if the other guy goes 3 and out a couple of times or, heaven forbid, turns the ball over. So that gave CJ Carr an edge on Kenny Minchey. I would argue that that also is what gave Julian Sayin the edge over Lincoln Kienholz. And even though, to get into McGee's wheelhouse, even though clearly long-term the right decision was made, in the moment as a freshman, I would even argue that's what gave Peyton Manning the edge over Brandon Stewart. That's just the way it is. If you've got the guy with the big recruiting profile, the bigger name, the one that the fans have been waiting to see, starting the other guy almost puts the other guy in a terrible position because inevitably, especially if he's a young quarterback, there will be moments when things don't go well. You risk not, you know, coaches aren't making these decisions for fans. I understand that. But they are trying to mitigate noise around their player, you know, whether that's external noise or in some cases internal, because a lot of quarterback battles, and I don't think that's the case at either Notre Dame or Ohio State, who we'll probably talk about in just a second. I'm not implying that's the case there, but it can be in some situations. You can have divided camps. Guy doesn't play well. You know, heck, I'll go ahead and say this out loud. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't think that, for sure, it looked like to me that receivers quit on a couple of balls. Remember that infamous Alabama USF game a couple of years ago when they benched Jalen Milroe? It didn't look like people wanted Tyler Buckner to be the quarterback. You know, now when Ty Simpson came in the second half, you didn't see that. Now, Tyler Buckner's a good guy, good player back at Notre Dame, probably will contribute to them this year. But my point of bringing all of this up is that coaches go, you got to win the job. Now, look, if Kenny Minchey or Lincoln Kienholz had gone out there and blown the doors off everybody, won the team in the locker room, won the scrimmages, they're playing. I'm not saying that for a second. I'm not saying the fix was in. But if it's close, if there's a tie, then there's a guy that projects a little bit higher or the guy that will diminish the noise. Then, heaven forbid, if you have to make a change for whatever reason, then everybody's on board with it. You know, instead of people clamoring for a change internally and externally, instead of people clamoring for it, it's obvious to everyone. So Notre Dame makes this decision. CJ played very well, and there are stories about CJ Carr last year, the wee hours of the night being caught on cameras inside the Notre Dame practice facility in there all by himself, working on footwork, ball handling, all the attention to detail. So he's going to get his shot against Miami to open up. I've ranted pretty well. Do you agree with my assessment, Dan, of how quarterback races often go? Not always, but often go.
Well, give me another famous one. Drew Henson kept Tom
There
Brady
you go.
from being
That's
right?
exactly right.
That was probably the ultimate one, the local 5-star recruit and this Tom Brady character. How good could he be? Yeah, I mean, that was the craziest quarterback battle of all time. They would play, one would play one quarter, the first quarter, the other would play the second quarter. Speaking of CJ Carr, this was his grandfather's idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then at halftime, the coaches would meet and decide who would play the second half. This is like, I think Auburn's trying that this year. We'll get to them, I hope. They may have 3 quarterbacks. They say if you have 2, you don't have any. What happens when you have 3? But absolutely. And in this era, a 5-star guy can transfer really quick. And I find all this, like, these coaches now are way more into, well, we got to let camp play out. We got to wait to the bitter end. Like 5 years ago, it was like, yeah, he's our starter. They'd name him at media day. Now it's all, oh my God, it's a secret. Who's going to start? Who's going to start? Right until you can't transfer anymore, or it's going to be much tougher. So, but there, look, usually a 5-star is a 5-star, if only because when throwing against air, when being in practice, like the ball pops off your hand quick. Like there's things that a 5-star will do that will excite scouts, coaches, all that stuff. And that doesn't necessarily mean they end up better because look, Tom Brady wasn't a 5-star recruit, right? He never had the biggest arm. He never could do well, yeah, but he could win. And you need him on last drive. He's going to throw it. Patrick Mahomes is not a 5-star recruit at all. So these things don't really matter in the end, but definitely gives a thing. It'll be very interesting to see how good CJ Carr is. And you step into all of these guys. They got a red shirt year that helps, but there's a lot of first time quarterbacks. They step into these enormous spotlights. Incredible expectations at Notre Dame right now, just incredible. And this roster is loaded, and there is big momentum. And the idea that all of a sudden Marcus Freeman has developed a little bit of experience as a head coach, and maybe they can avoid the early season letdown, but that playoff run just gave so much credibility to him and shows where he's at. He's going to need to be good really quick, especially when they're playing Miami right off the bat.
Yeah, what's a young quarterback's best friend, right? Or an inexperienced quarterback's best friend?
Run the ball.
Run the ball. And man, Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price, at wide receiver, Jaden Greathouse suddenly became the greatest wide receiver in the history of football in that national championship game. If you can keep any momentum going at all with those guys, that's your best friend. I was thinking about the quarterback thing. I remember with two instances. I'm talking to you right now from South Charlotte. Chris Leak was one of the greatest high school quarterbacks I ever saw. Independence High School, just up the road from where I'm sitting. Everybody forgets Tim Tebow's first national championship. He was not the starting quarterback. It was Chris Leak. But you talk about noise, and Tebow, they played him just enough to keep everybody happy, but it was super tense. All Chris Leak was doing was winning football games, and everyone wanted him benched because Tebow was a local guy. He obviously is one of the greatest of all time, and the Heisman, all those things. But Tebow, there was a lot, and I'm not the biggest Urban Meyer guy, but I've always given him a lot of credit for how they handled that, throughout that year. And then, I think a lot about on the eve of the Clemson Alabama national championship game in Tampa. And, so they have media days, and, we're in a basketball arena, and they would let fans come in and sit in the stands and watch media day, which sounds crazy, but God bless them. Those are our people. But the Alabama fans cheered Tua Tagovailoa when he walked in as the backup because they thought Jalen Hurts shouldn't be playing. And Jalen Hurts came within one Clemson pick and roll of winning the national championship 2 nights later. But that noise is for real. And anyone that tells you it doesn't affect them, Chris Leak will tell you it affected him. I think Jalen will tell you it affected him. And it's a real thing. So yeah, but the difference is back in the day, those guys are going to stick around. And Dan's exactly right. Now you better keep them happy, or at least make them think they have a chance. Otherwise, you'll be playing against them the next year.
Hey, one of the things that Saban says often is that football is the greatest team sport ever invented, except for one position.
Yeah.
And that is a little bit more of an individual sport. Some of it's because of the leadership aspect. Some of it is because only one can play. This is not the old wishbone days where you were running the same plays no matter what, and anybody could run. Not anybody could do it, but I mean, if they were a quarterback on a wishbone team, they all could run the option, they all could run the belly series, they all could carry the ball, and there wasn't a whole lot of difference many times in who was a quarterback. Even I remember Bobby Bowden alternating quarterbacks to great success early in his career at Florida State in the early 80s. So those times have passed by. The one thing I would
I have
say
an assignment for you, Rece. I have an assignment.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right.
Can you ask Coach Saban what you brought up that game against South Florida when he benched Jalen Milroe?
Yeah.
One of the most baffling football games I've ever. What was that?
That's the question.
I mean,
That's
that's it. What was going on? I've never heard a real explanation for why this happened. They almost lost to some, like, this is Nick Saban. He perfectly coached pretty much every game except when he tried that field goal against Auburn and didn't make it all the way. But other than that, I mean, there's a few blips, but for the most, I won't bring that up in polite company. But what was that? What was the, can you, because I'm sure Coach Saban, like millions of others, are listening, but if he isn't, just in case he missed this episode of the College Game Day podcast, can you just find out and then report back to us?
Okay. I'll look into
baffled.
that. I've, you know what? I don't recall. I don't think I've talked to Nick about it. People around, I think this was one of those, and I'll get this confirmed. I think this was one of those tests of leadership, because remember, Milroe had just taken over. He wasn't established as, as the leader of the team. I think it was a test of leadership. There's a famous story about AJ McCarron, who came in red hot, running warm. And Nick, one of the guys who didn't mind running warm at Nick from time to time. And he came in his freshman year mad because he got all of his series in practice with the threes instead of with the twos. And Saban famously told him, this was a test of leadership and you flunked. So I suspect.
Maybe that was it. Okay.
I suspect. I don't know
Risky.
that for a fact. It's speculation, but I suspect there was something along those lines. And that was also the year, I remember Thamel and I doing the podcast, and there was the expectation that Buckner was going to start, and there were some inside the program who thought that Ty Simpson would ultimately win the job on the field, and practice didn't work out that way. Jalen won it, and Jalen went on to, play very, very well, for the most part, and had some tremendous moments for Alabama over the last couple of years. But people thought Simpson might win that job at that time, and didn't work out. And that's another thing with this quarterback race. If you have the credibility, and I don't think anyone in the history of college football has had the credibility that Nick had at that time to do exactly what he wanted with his quarterbacks, and if you question that, you probably ought to do it at a very low whisper. But he had that credibility. If a coach is in a more tenuous situation, then they have to be a little bit more, a little bit careful with how they handle those situations. Notre Dame, though, Notre Dame has the great running game that you mentioned, but they do have some issues in terms of, they only had a couple of offensive line starters returning. Charles Jagusah, who, he's been star-crossed the last couple of years, missed almost all of the season, and then came back to start the Penn State game and the national championship game, was supposed to start the season at left tackle a year ago, had an ATV accident, broken arm. He's going to miss the start of the season, expected back at some point. So to deal with the new quarterback in CJ Carr and to try to unleash this running game, there are some different faces and different roles on the offensive front. I still think they're going to be really good because they're really deep there. But, I don't think it's inappropriate to question how that's going to look, in the early going until they settle in, when you would imagine that Miami is going to force them to prove that CJ Carr can beat them throwing the football. And they also have a couple of new weapons at wide receiver. I'm even with some questions which are perfectly fair. I'm pretty high on Notre Dame this year. I think Notre Dame's going to be really good. The quarterback will settle in, and I think they're going to be really good. I think they're going to win the first two games. I think they're going to beat Miami. I think they'll beat A&M too.
Well, it's the schedule to me. It's the start. I mean, this has all got to come together quick. At Miami, they get Texas A&M at home. They have Purdue at home. They're at Arkansas, which can be tricky, and it's going to be absolutely wild. And then they get Boise State, and NC State's not that bad, and then USC. It eases late, maybe, but it's not going to be easy. So they got to be ready to go.
Yeah, and then Miami to me kind of encapsulates college football this year, because I don't know. I think they could be good, but I don't think they're the 10th best team in the country, which is where they're sitting right now in the preseason poll. So I have at least one giant question about every team in the country. And then there's a lot in the middle. Rece, I can't think of a year that I've gone into where, and maybe this is a byproduct of the transfer portal, but I understand Miami had a great year last year, but the quarterback's pretty good, and we all knew he was good. And so I don't know. I don't know if I'm all in on Miami, but if you're Notre Dame, you beat a team with a top 10 number next to it. week one, they're not gonna have any questions about that. That's a big win. But Miami to me kind of sums up my feeling about college football just in general this year, which is, I think there's a lot of teams, and I think almost every team, and certainly the top half of the top 25 preseason, they could be really good. And in a 12-team playoff, they could be in the postseason. But I also could come up with an argument why they could have a disappointing year. And I put Miami in that, and maybe at the top of that group.